Hello and welcome to another edition of the Office Hours podcast. I'm Cisco Cotto, one of the pastoral studies professors at Moody Bible Institute. Our students have been going through the Kent Hughes book, Disciplines of a Godly Man. This episode is going to be about the discipline of marriage. Some people are called to singleness, many people are called to marriage, and as followers of Jesus, we want to make sure that we have marriages that are healthy and holy, exactly as God built them to be. Obviously, we're all sinners and we mess this up at times, but we're focusing on trying to have marriages that thrive as God designed them. I have a couple of guests here today, beginning with Klavs Vadonis, who's a sophomore student at Moody Bible Institute. Klavs, good to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
And Dr. Bob MacRae. We'll call him Bob. I still have a tough time not calling you Dr. MacRae.
Okay, Dr. Cotto.
Dr. Cotto, yes. He is professor of youth ministry and marriage and family at Moody Bible Institute. He and his wife, Dr. Pam MacRae, teach the marriage and family systems class. I appreciate you making yourself available to be a part of this. Let's begin with maybe some biblical wisdom on marriage from the standpoint of God has given us this gift. Why did he give us this gift? He could have designed it differently. He could have designed us all for singleness or larger community or something. And instead, he created this male-female relationship.
Yeah. Genesis 2 tells us that God said, it's not good for man to be alone. And so he created woman for him and for the purpose of marriage, for the purpose of procreating. And like you said, he could have chosen to have mankind procreate any way he wanted. And he chose something very, very special in the relationship of marriage.
And yet, we mess this up because also Genesis lets us know that even though God designed this wonderful union, we sin, and from that point forward, it just seems like there's tension in not just about every marriage.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very, very special relationship, but it can be a very, very difficult relationship because you have two sinners coming together and trying to figure this out.
Before we get into the disciplines of marriage, can I just ask, how long have you been married and how did you meet your wife?
Yeah, sure. My wife and I, we just celebrated 45 years of marriage this past summer. We got married when we were 10. We got 45 years, okay? Right. Where we met, I actually, after I graduated, a couple of years after I graduated, I was invited to come back here to Moody and work in student recruitment. And I did that, and Pam was a student at Moody at that time. They didn't clearly explain to me that I wasn't supposed to recruit present students, and so Pam and I started dating. We dated about a year. We were engaged for a year, my first year in seminary, and now we've been married for 45. We have 2 wonderful daughters and 2 great sons-in-law and 6 grandchildren. So,
when they talked about recruitment, they didn't, recruiting a life partner.
Right, yeah. I didn't quite understand that one. So
Moody Bridal Institute. That's what they say, right?
Right.
So we see God's good design in marriage. It is a gift. We see that sin messes it up. And yet, as we consider marriage, and you and I are married, Klavs someday aspires to marriage, or many people are going to be watching this who aspire to marriage, there are probably some foundational principles that we have to keep in mind, beginning with, for example, and Hughes talks about this in the book, an important reminder that marriage is until death do us part. Mm-hmm. And so if you're 20 or 23 or 27 and you're getting ready to walk down that aisle, you have to keep that in mind, that this is not a temporary thing. There is no returning this to the store or something.
Yeah, I mean, it grieves me sometimes when I hear people who aren't believers express marriage vows as long as we shall both love each other, and it's like, you're signing up for a temporary relationship. And one of the things that I feel the scripture is very clear on is for believers, Cisco, just like you said, no, this is lifetime. The good and the bad, the ugly, and you hear of believers walking away from a marriage because, I'm not happy, or this isn't fulfilling my needs. Well, nowhere in Scripture does that say that's, a qualification for hanging in on a marriage.
Does that influence how, I know you've done premarital counseling. Does that influence how you do premarital counseling? Hey, let's just get past this right now. It's not about your happiness, not about, we hope that you are happy.
Yeah.
But that's not the line, the marker, the judgment, the ruler to say, is this a marriage that needs to continue?
Yeah, I mean, life can be challenging. You think of various things that can happen, illness, mental illness, all right? Children who have disabilities, or you're having discipline issues, all those things bring tension onto a marriage. And yet, again, in premarital counseling, we talk about the fact that, we do, as believers who want to honor God with our lives, we don't have the option to, when it gets tough or when our spouse does something that frustrates us or disappoints us over and over and over again, that's an excuse to bail. So
yeah, the lordship of Christ in keeping that. I've been married 20 years, not quite 45. I hope to get to 45 and even more than that. I've been married 20, and the lordship of Christ, this understanding that I am to obey Christ and submit to Christ. If I'm in a situation where there's tension or disagreement in my marriage, I have to obey and submit to Christ.
Yeah.
Just repeating that to myself has
Yes.
been one of the most vital things in working through the inevitable challenges that happen in marriage.
Yeah, exactly. A number of years ago, when I was still teaching marriage and family by myself, my wife and I have been teaching it together for 19 years, but I taught it for about 6 years before, just by myself. I had a student ask me, said, "Bob, you've been married quite a few years. What has marriage taught you?" And I just thought for a second, and I said, "Marriage has taught me how incredibly selfish I am." And
Which is so painful.
Yes.
It's good because it's part of that sanctification.
Yeah.
It's part of that refinement.
Yes.
And yet I really wish I didn't have to find that out.
Right. And there's a very good chance outside of a marriage relationship, you wouldn't think of yourself that way,
Yeah, you're exactly right.
Yeah.
So, Klavs, as and I hate to put you on the spot, as a student who aspires to be married someday,
Of course.
We can help you out too.
That's exactly, yes, matchmaker.
Yeah.
Are there any fears or concerns that you have about someday making that commitment? As someone who, you're on this end, I'm sort of hopefully midway, aspiring to get to 45 in many more years. What are you thinking about it?
Well, I represent probably most of the Moody men who aren't yet married, and that's one thing I'm wondering about is how do I discipline myself now in order to have a successful marriage? What are the disciplines that I have to start now? Because there was this quote in the book that was like really shocking to me, which actually is really true. Ken Hughes said, "If you are married, the presence or lack of spiritual discipline can serve to sanctify or damn your children or grandchildren." So I just thought it was very powerful, and I think my fear is that I won't be able to meet that disciplinary need. So I guess my question is, how can I discipline myself now and all the male Moodysons who aren't yet married in order to have a successful marriage?
Yeah, that is a great question. And I think sometimes we think that, okay, I've got these few years here where I can coast, right? And someday when I graduate from Moody and I'm in ministry full time, that's when I'll kick it in terms of spiritual disciplines, or when it comes to that time of getting married, that's when I'll kick it in. And Klavs, my recommendation to you is to allow God to help you to become the kind of man while you're single that a Christian woman who wants to be like Christ will be attracted to. And one of the things that Kent Hughes says in his book that I think is great when he talks about how husbands need to be interceding for their wives. One of the things that I was challenged to do probably when I was about your age was to be praying for my future wife. And about that same time in Pam's life, she was challenged to do the same, pray for her future husband. And I didn't know this at the time, but I prayed my wife through a 4-year relationship with another guy. She prayed me through a couple relationships with other girls. And we were praying for each other's holiness. We were praying for each other's life, that God would be working in our lives and so forth. And it was really kind of fun when we got to that point of realizing that God was calling us together for a lifelong relationship, to think we've had a ministry going on in each other's lives for these years before. She was dating a guy that she thought she was going to marry, but she's still praying for her future husband, not realizing it was me at the time. We'd never met. And so that's one thing that I would challenge the guys here at school and other single guys to be doing, is praying for your future wife.
Hmm. Is there something you would have done differently before you got married?
Help me understand that one a little bit more.
Especially about talking about like disciplines. So prayer is one thing, but maybe just talk about like, are there other things that you would have done differently, discipline-wise?
Again, great question. I mean, I think we look back and all of us wish we had done things differently. But I am very, very grateful that even as a high school student, I was being challenged to spend time in God's Word. I was being challenged to be a man of integrity, and one of the things I push so hard with my students here is that they need to be men and women of integrity. And so I think, you look back and you see times and places where that wasn't true in your life, and we confess that, we learn from that, we grow older and wiser, hopefully, and we see God's wisdom. I know that I mentioned my wife having a 4-year relationship, me having a couple girlfriends. I know one of the things that I think is dangerous, I believe, for a lot of not only students here at Moody, but others in the Christian community, is this sense that when you date someone, that before you even date somebody, you almost need to be convinced that this person is the one that you're supposed to marry, and so you, quote, date for marriage. You know what? It takes a while to get to know someone. And sometimes when you get to know somebody, it's like, nice person, but not necessarily a person I want to spend the rest of my life with. And that's not a failure. That's not sin, okay? And I sense that with the younger generation, there's a lot more pressure that I've got to figure this out and get it right from the get-go. And so when I look back at dating other girls, I had a whole bunch of first and second dates, right? And it's not like I regret that or wish I had done that differently, because I think one of the benefits of that is when I first started dating Pam, I was attracted to her qualities. I was attracted to her godliness. I was attracted to her desire to, I loved being able to have a theological conversation with her. And she stuck out to me as being different, as opposed to the fact that I was in love with the fact of being in love, or, she wears a skirt, she must be the right one. Do you know what I'm saying? I was able to, some people say this is bad, but I was able to kind of compare. It's like, no, she stands out. And not that she would have stood out to everyone, but she stood out to me. And not that I would have stood out to everyone. I didn't. But, I stood out to her.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about my college years. I dated one girl for 2 years, thought I was going to marry her. Yeah. Dated another girl for 3 years, thought I was going to marry her. And then years later, I met Anna, and it's a very similar story to what you're saying. The first two girls I dated for long periods of time, wonderful women.
Yeah,
They're
yeah.
now married. They have great
Yeah.
marriages, wonderful kids. I mean,
Yeah.
everything turned out well for them. I look back and I said, if I'd married her or if I'd married her, I would be miserable and they would be miserable married to me.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's because that long period of dating wasn't necessarily about us eventually getting married. It was the Lord using it to show me,
Yeah.
here's what you really want in a wife.
Yeah.
And for me, it's the same thing. Anna and I have these great theological discussions. We've planted two churches together.
Yeah.
I mean, we really are these ministry partners in
Yeah.
life. And I don't know if that would have happened
Yeah.
if in any of those relationships it was marriage or bust here.
Yeah.
You know, we're
Yeah.
going to do that.
Yeah.
And yet, Bob, for Christian young people, is that more difficult because there is this pressure to be married. There is this pressure to have that partnership. So how do they say, I'm going to get in this relationship. It might last a year and not work out, and
Yeah.
that's okay.
Yeah.
You know, that's all right.
I think there needs to be a little bit of a culture shift for that to happen. And a great book that we have our students reading in marriage and family class is a book called Talking Back to Purity Culture. And a lot of things that we do in the church, we have great intentions for, but sometimes we don't totally think things through. And, when we talk about the whole purity culture, it's the idea that I think for a lot of people's thoughts, like, well, if I do this, and this, then God has promised me a perfect marriage, wonderful sex, kids that, don't rebel. And then when those things don't happen, we go, God has failed us. God hasn't failed us. We just put promises into, His being that weren't there, And so part of that whole thinking is the thought that, well, we date only for marriage, And, some have even written that when you break up in a dating relationship, you're practicing divorce. It's like, no, you're getting yourself perhaps out of a relationship that wouldn't have been good for
You might have
45
ended
years.
up divorced
Right.
if you had stayed in that relationship.
Yeah.
I want to talk about Ephesians.
Sure.
Because Hughes gets into that quite a bit in the book. Very important section of Scripture. Ephesians 5. I notice, and I've seen this as a pastor who's counseled many men in different marriage situations, that they usually like verses 22 through 24. Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. They love that section. That's great. They want to sit on that for a while. And yet, thankfully, Hughes focuses on what comes after, which almost seems impossible. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle, or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. And Paul ends up telling us this is a mystery. Marriage is this beautiful picture of Christ's relationship with the church. Now, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. How do we even begin a marriage with that as our mindset? I mean, it really is, as Hughes says, it really is dying to self from the beginning and then day in and day out. This is not about me. This is about me building her up.
Yeah. That is a great question. And so many times I've heard guys say, as Christ sacrificed for the church, well, he gave his life, right? And so kind of like, well, I'd take a bullet for my wife. The only thing is most of us are never going to be asked to take a bullet for our wife, right? And, you asked if I had any regrets. I think of a regret early on in our marriage. And this was not all that unique of a thought back then, 45 years ago. And I don't think I would have ever vocalized this, but in my mind, I thought, isn't this wonderful that God has given me a woman, a wife, to help me be successful in what God has called me to do? And at that point, I was a youth pastor in a church, and isn't this great? I've got the sidekick, all right, who's there to help me be successful in what God has called me to do. And I didn't give a whole lot of thought to the fact that there was also a calling on my wife's life. And part of, I believe, Cisco, this sacrificial love is, what can I do to help my wife be successful in what God has called her to do? And in our case, it was my wife going back to school. My wife loves to learn. She loves to be in the classroom. And in the early days of our marriage, I was thinking, it's expensive. That's money that we don't have. And why would you need it anyway? You graduated from Moody. You know, you're going to be a pastor's wife forever, right? Little did I know, little did she know that, she's been now a professor for 20 years. She has her doctorate, right? But so I think part of sacrificing for each other is being willing to give up things for the sake of the other. And I do love how Hughes in his book talks about the idea of the sacrificial love of what we give up, in terms of we're kind of like dying to ourselves the same way we do in our relationship with the Lord. But he also talked about that sanctifying love that you're kind of referring to there, Cisco, that is what I'm doing and is how I'm treating my wife, helping her to become more like Christ, or am I a hindrance in some way? And you read that, and that can be a little scary, because it's like, wow, I do not want to be the one responsible for being a discouragement, being a hurdle in my wife's pursuit of Christ.
Yeah. So you've been married for 40 years.
45.
45.
Yeah.
Don't take anything away from it.
45.
Yeah.
And you've both been married for a long time.
Yeah.
So maybe it's even a question for both of you. How do you keep a relationship exciting after such a long time?
It's intentional.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, we had an episode on purity, and this is one of the things I meant to talk about, and we ran out of time. That from the moment you're married, maybe even before that, maybe even while you're in a courtship or whatever you want to call it, there has to be an intentionality of how am I going to build into this relationship spiritually? How am I going to build into the connection as husband and wife, spending time together? Gary Chapman in his 5 Love Languages book, figuring out what my wife's love language is, and trying to build into her in that way and help her feel loved. I feel like it is so easy. It's easy the longer you're married for things to be stale, not because you want them to be stale, but because life gets in the way. You might have children, and they have all kinds of responsibilities. There's things around the house. There's things at work. There's health issues. And so it's really easy to just go through the motions long enough to all of a sudden say, wait, do we even still love each other? I understand why that happens later on in a marriage. And the way, I think, to avoid that is to be intentional, like you would anything else on your calendar, to be intentional to say, are we having date nights? Are we having just conversations that are unhurried in the house? Are we in the Word and prayer together? Are we planning weekends away? Are we doing all these things and making sure that they're happening with some sort of regularity? Because without that intentional spiritual and relational emphasis, it just goes and goes and goes. Before you know it, 3 months have gone by, 6 months have gone by, a year has gone by. Anna and I had to train our kids very early. There are times that mommy and daddy are going to go away, and you're going to be upset about it. We're going to leave you with a babysitter. So we're not just going to put food on the counter and, say goodbye. But mommy and daddy are going to go away, and someday you're going to be really glad that we did.
Yeah.
Because we're still going to be together and love each other and all of that. So I would say that intentionality right from the beginning. Don't take this relationship for granted.
Yeah. I love the word intentionality right there, because I do think it's easy after a while, you kind of can put your marriage on autopilot and assume it's just going to, take care of itself. And I know that, and Ken Hughes mentioned this in his book, the idea about listening, the idea of asking questions. I've learned that when, I've been away or teaching my classes, Pam will say, well, how'd your day go? Pretty good is not a satisfactory answer. My wife wants to know the details from start to finish, well, who'd you talk to? And it's not like a thing like, well, who were you talking to? It's like, I'm just interested, and I think this can also just, I don't like to always make stereotypes of men and women, but I think that's one of those ones that kind of holds true. The women want to know all the details, and to take the time to do that and to answer those questions. And again, one of the things I loved about the book was where it emphasized communication and emphasized asking questions, and I think that kind of touches in with some of the love languages, of feeling special when you're asking questions. And it means sometimes doing things that aren't your natural bent. If I was living by myself, going for a walk would probably not be high on my list. My wife loves going for walks. And so, you go for a walk and use that time to talk, ask questions, and so forth. And, that's more important than watching 6 football games in a weekend,
Although they're exciting.
There were some good ones.
There were some good ones. So our time is short,
Yeah.
and one of the things that I want to make sure that we get to is the pressure that young men especially feel as they approach marriage, feeling as though I have to be engaging in these disciplines. I have to be engaging in them with this wife. I have to be attentive to her. I have to be intentional. I have to build her up. I have to, whether it's in ministry or somewhere else, I have to be providing for the family. And there's so many projects around the house. There's just so much going on. How do we tell these young men how to give themselves grace? You are an imperfect human being.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to nail all of this. How can we we want them to feel the pressure in the sense that, hey, we want to get to this and really focus on it. But we don't want them to say, I'm just not even going to get married because I don't think I can possibly do this.
Yeah. That's a great question. One of the things that I have seen over the years that I've been teaching here, and particularly teaching in the marriage and family class, is it seems like there's a higher percentage of students who indicate, I don't want to get married. And I think part of that might be is because they've seen the failure of their parents' marriages, and it's like, I don't want to risk, having that happen to me, particularly if they come from homes where mom and dad are professing believers and the marriage didn't last. It's like, I don't think I even want to try. I think one of the things we do need to remind ourselves of is God's grace, and also the fact that God empowers us through His Holy Spirit to do what we've been called to do. But our whole process of sanctification is just that. It's a process. And hopefully today I am a better husband and I'm a better follower of Jesus, better when it's probably not the best choice of words, but than I was 45 years ago, and we don't enter into marriage, we don't enter into ministry as having everything figured out. And so we need to just realize, okay, this is a step-by-step process. And until we are with God in eternity, we're never going to have it perfected. So I do believe that we need to give ourselves some grace, but I also think it's good to have people who can hold us accountable. sometimes people take grace to the extreme, and it's like, no, you just need a kick in the pants. You need to go get a job. You know what I mean? I'm just giving myself grace. No, you have to support your wife. You can't be staying home playing video games all day long. So,
but it's a live game, Bob. It's a live game. If I don't play it, my friends are online right now.
Well, your wife's more important than your friends. So,
she will be there longer, for sure, Lord willing. Well, it's a great conversation. Hope you're both encouraged. I know I am. Klavs, Vadonis, thank you for being here. Appreciate all the help you've had with these podcasts, too. Appreciate that. And Dr. Bob MacRae. Bob MacRae, just so appreciate you. Appreciate Pam. There's a reason why so many Moody alums want to find out what the MacRaes are doing when they come back to campus, because
they're still here.
That's right. And we hope for a long time. Really, just served Moody and its students very well. So thanks, Bob.
And it's good being here. Thank you.
And thank you all for joining us on the Office Hours podcast. We'll see you back here again.